On November 21st, 2020, the BBC published an article about an adventurous couple who had spent 6 years traveling around Europe in a camper van. And then the very next day, the woman highlighted in this article vanished off the face of the earth. Esther Dingley had set off on a solo backpacking trip in the Pyrenees Mountains, which was a feat that was well within her abilities. She was an extremely experienced hiker, which made it all the more suspicious when she didn't return home from her trek. As the search for Esther ramped up, theories began bouncing around on the internet. Did she have an accident on the mountain, or did she simply run away to start a new life? Was it possible that maybe foul play was involved? All of these theories were looked into, and investigators even used her last photo, which was taken just moments before she disappeared, to try and search for clues in the reflection of her sunglasses. They searched and searched, but eventually winter set in and the search had to be called off. No sign of Esther had been found, and at this point it seemed like everyone, the media and those closest to Esther included, believed that foul play was the culprit behind her disappearance. Some seedy journalists even speculated that her partner Dan Colgate himself may have been involved. Months went by, and as the case received more and more attention, the theories continued to stack up. But then, Dan Colgate made a discovery that would go on to serve as a case study for why wild speculation, theories, and internet guesswork should always be taken with a massive grain of salt. This is the wild story of Esther Dingley, her disappearance and death, and the media storm that surrounded it. Folks, this is an incredibly fascinating and, of course, an incredibly sad story. There's no happy ending in this one, I'm just going to tell you that right up front, but there is some closure. However, back to the fascinating thing actually, what makes this story so fascinating to me is that multiple theories were put forth by the authorities, the media, and even Esther's partner himself. Yet when the case was actually solved, it turned out that none of these theories were actually true, and rather the most obvious, for lack of a better word, reason for Esther's disappearance was, in fact, true. I think it's a good lesson in human nature. Sometimes, well, we seek out the most dramatic and story-worthy explanations, and in the process, well, we overlook the most realistic explanations. So with that said, let's go on a virtual trip to the Pyrenees Mountains of France and Spain. I've heard it's absolutely beautiful there. I have a friend who traveled there recently, and I'm gonna take you all there right now for free. But all you have to do is hit that subscribe button to cover your admission. We're almost at 500,000 subscribers, which is insane. And so if you've been enjoying my videos, I'd really appreciate your help getting us there. In 2002, Esther Dingley and Dan Colgate met each other while they were attending Oxford University. They bonded over their shared interests in fitness, in outdoor pursuits, and in traveling, and this bond quickly turned into a relationship, a very long one at that. Flash forward to the beginning of 2014, and the couple was set to get married. Everything about their lives looked pretty perfect on the surface, but little did anybody know, everything in Dan and Esther's world was about to get turned upside down. The next chapter of Dan and Esther's life was incredibly difficult, to put it mildly. And so before we get into some of the darker aspects of this story, I want to lighten things up for just a moment and talk about something positive. That thing is Drink Element, who is the sponsor of this video. I gotta ask you a very personal question. Come here. Are you a sweater? Well, I am. And the thing is, when I'm out hiking or exercising or doing anything that makes me sweat, well, I get dehydrated, I get muscle cramps, I get fatigued, and the reason for this, well, it's not just the dehydration, it's actually because, well, I'm not replacing my electrolytes. But that doesn't happen to me anymore because of Drink Element. Drink Element is the best electrolyte drink mix company in the game. I say this all the time, but it's really not even close. First of all, Drink Element tastes amazing. I'm telling you, you're not gonna find another drink mix company that tastes as good as Drink Element does. They have awesome flavors like orange salt, citrus salt, grapefruit salt, and the best part is that Drink Element is not loaded with sugar and other BS like you find in pretty much every other electrolyte drink mix. All it has is the electrolytes that you need to stay hydrated and healthy, and it has a great taste. So if I were you, what I would do is head over to drinkelement.com/KyleHatesHiking. That's drinklmnt.com/KyleHatesHiking. Go make a purchase of whatever flavor sounds best to you. And when you do that, you're gonna get a sample pack thrown in with your order. It has 8 different flavors, and it's gonna be thrown in for no additional cost. So you're gonna get to try all those amazing flavors I just told you about and all the ones I didn't tell you about. They have a lot of them. It's a great deal. One more time, drinklmnt.com/KyleHatesHiking, or click that link in the description. And with that said, let's get back to the video. In February of 2014, only 3 weeks before the scheduled wedding for Esther Dingley and Dan Colgate, well, Dan Colgate came within inches of losing his life in a very awful fashion, by the way. Dan contracted an extremely rare and life-threatening infection, and I don't even know how to pronounce this. Levi will put it on the screen right now, but I've seen it described as a flesh-eating disease. So, yeah, not very good, to put it mildly. Dan's condition was so serious that doctors even told Esther to, like, say her final goodbyes to Dan, just in case he didn't make it, which is just insane, and I can't imagine being put in that situation. Thankfully, though, Dan did make it. He survived. And once he started recovering, the couple reportedly transformed their relationship. Esther was quoted saying, "We really loved to travel, and we kept saying one day we would do it, but there was always another project, another job. We were always just chasing the next objective. Then, all of a sudden, someone turns around and says, the person I love and was planning to do it all with could be gone by the morning." And so, within the first few weeks of Dan's recovery, the couple made a very bold move, one that countless other couples and individuals, for that matter, dream about but don't actually do. The couple sold their car, they rented out their apartment, and they moved into a camper van. The plan was to spend the next year living on the road, exploring the beauty that Europe has to offer. And the icing on the cake was that once Dan was fully recovered, the couple hoped that the flexibility and the freedom of this new lifestyle would allow them to spend as much time as they wanted doing their 2 favorite things, which were cycling and hiking mountains. This hope would actually end up turning into their reality, and it seemed as though the couple was having so much fun in their adventures that their 1-year travel plans turned into 2 years, which then turned into 3 years. And before they knew it, well, folks, it turned into 6 full years. Esther and Dan started a blog to share their experiences with the world. They worked odd jobs here and there to avoid completely draining their savings, and they gradually got rid of all of their possessions that didn't fit inside the camper van. In 2017, they adopted a stray dog, and then they quickly found out that that dog was pregnant, and so just like that, boom, now they have 5 dogs living with them in the camper van, which was an unexpected turn of events that would actually go on to serve as the inspiration behind their children's book. The book was titled Puppy Pack Adventures, which was published in October of 2020. And I know that Dan Colgate also published a number of other books, and they were just doing it all, folks. Oh, and by the way, speaking of the year 2020, I think we all remember the craziness that ensued that year. I mean, lives were lost, livelihoods were lost, and the entire world was basically just thrown into chaos. And of course, this chaos ended, or at the very least challenged, many personal relationships for all of us. And of course, Esther and Dan, well, they weren't immune to this. Now, to be clear, the couple did not break up during the COVID pandemic, but they did take it as an opportunity to spend some time apart, still in a relationship, just in different physical locations. Esther was quoted saying, "We realized during the coronavirus we had not been apart from each other for a year. So we decided to each just do our own thing for a bit. This whole thing has been really good for us individually and our relationship. We are genuinely happy now." Esther and Dan spent at least 80 days hiking together from July 17th through October 4th, completing a 1,000+ mile hike through the Alps. This is a side note, but I think this should illustrate just how experienced and skilled Esther was in the outdoors. And it should also come as no surprise that she felt comfortable hiking in the mountains by herself as well. So back to their relationship, Esther and Dan made that decision to spend some time apart shortly after finishing this long hike. And thus, Esther set out in the camper van by herself, and she spent the next few weeks exploring the Pyrenees Mountains along the French and Spanish border, heading out into the wilderness for like a few days at a time, and then returning back to the van. When France introduced some very strict stay-at-home orders due to the coronavirus pandemic again, well, Esther decided to head across the border into Spain, eventually arriving in the town of Benasque. By the way, folks, this is the point in the story where we start to get to a lot of Spanish and French words of places and mountains and stuff. And as my regular viewers know, I am terrible at pronouncing even English words, and so please bear with me while I try to pronounce these French and Spanish words. It's not going to be pretty, but I apologize. After spending a few days trail running and backpacking near Benasque, Esther set out on one last hike before she planned to return to France. The date was November 21st, 2020, and she took supplies for a 4 to 5 day backpacking trip, planning to summit a mountain called, here we go, Pic de Sauvegarde. This also just so happened to be the day that the BBC published their article highlighting Dan and Esther's nomadic lifestyle. Esther planned to return from her hike on November 25th, but unfortunately, she never made it back to town. However, unlike many missing hiker cases where someone is never heard from again after they start their hike, Esther had communicated quite frequently with Dan during the first 2 days of her adventure. So the same day that she hiked out, that is November 21st, once again, Esther sent numerous texts to Dan throughout the day, including when she reached the summit of the mountain. And while she was on top of this mountain, she wrote a message to Dan that said, quote, "Love you so much, XXX. Thank you for encouraging me and giving me this confidence. Really appreciated all the messages to get me on my way this morning." It then appears that Esther descended the mountain and, well, she lost cell phone service. However, Dan heard from her again the next day when she actually climbed back up to the summit. It was here that the couple exchanged a series of texts, they had a quick video chat, and Esther confirmed that she had spent the night at a remote mountain hut called Cabana de la Becertas. This is also the point in our story where Esther sent Dan this selfie. It shows her smiling wide in the midst of doing what she loved the most, which was climbing mountains and spending time immersed in remote nature. There's absolutely nothing unusual, let alone disturbing, about this photo, except for the fact that it would go on to be the last photo ever taken of Esther Dingley. After sending Dan the selfie, they exchanged a few more text messages, with Esther's last message indicating that she would be heading down the mountain on the French side of the border. She wrote, quote, "Tomorrow heading for Port de la Glaire," or something spelt like that. "Might dip into France. Hoping Refuge Benasque has a winter room. Keep you posted when can. Love you, XX." November 23rd and November 24th, both these days went by and nobody, including Dan, received any messages from Esther. But this wasn't exactly cause for concern, because while she was very good about communicating her status while on solo adventures, Dan and Esther's family knew that cell service was very unreliable in the mountains. However, nobody heard from Esther on November 25th either. Again, this was supposed to be the day that she returned from her hike, and so by the end of the day, Dan Colgate made the very difficult decision to report her missing. Now, because Esther was hiking on and around the French-Spanish border, agencies from both countries set out searching for her literally first thing in the morning on November 26th. And I imagine that many of the searchers figured they would find her pretty quickly. And I say that because A, she was an incredibly experienced hiker and she knew how to handle herself in an unexpected emergency, and B, because, well, the searchers were about to go, pardon my language here, the searchers were about to go hard as f***. I really mean that, folks. They were on the ground at sunrise the morning after Esther was reported missing, and they threw everything they had at this search. They used dogs, they used helicopters, they used a magnitude of professional, highly trained searchers that knew those specific mountains like the back of their hand. The Spanish teams even used high-powered telescopes to scan the area around where she was last known to have been. Searchers spared zero effort, even spending time looking underneath rocks and climbing down into crevasses in case Esther had become trapped in one. I know that they used drones as well, and in addition to this massive effort, the search for Esther Dingley had another asset working for it, and that was Dan Colgate himself. Nobody knew Esther and her habits in the outdoors as well as Dan did. And so while the search for Esther commenced, well, Dan began hiking around the terrain near her last known location by himself, searching for her, even continuing into the night on many occasions outside of the normal search and rescue hours. This massive effort to locate Esther lasted for 6 entire days. But then, on December 2nd, winter finally reared its ugly head, and the area around the mountain that she was missing from received a massive dumping of snow. And because of this, the search unfortunately stalled, and soon after, well, it was halted indefinitely. And folks, by this point, many questions were being asked about what the hell had happened to Esther. These questions were largely due to the fact that she had not been found despite such a massive and thorough search, and these questions only increased as the story began to make international headlines. I really hate to say this, but Esther's disappearance really made for catchy articles and headlines. You've got this attractive, outdoorsy couple living this dreamy nomadic lifestyle, and then all of a sudden something goes horribly wrong and, well, mystery ensues. I think you can probably understand what I mean here. That particular storyline was certain to capture the public's attention, and, well, that's exactly what happened. Throw in some public speculation from the police and also from Dan himself, and, well, you've got yourself a viral story. The first theory that the media seemed to really grab onto was the theory that Esther disappeared willingly in order to start a new life or to possibly flee her relationship with Dan. Here's what I mean. I think this headline from the Daily Mail sums this speculation up pretty well. One of the leaders of the French part of the investigation into the disappearance is quoted numerous times throughout this article, and in these quotes, he suggests that there may have been trouble in Esther and Dan's relationship. This investigator said, quote, "It does not seem probable that Esther suffered an accident, and it is not credible that she was eaten by a bear or that she has fallen into a lake. We believe that her disappearance is either the result of a voluntary act or as a result of someone else's actions. We went to see Mr. Colgate so that we could go through social media with him, messages, etc." And then the investigator dropped the bombshell line that journalists all over the world took advantage of. He said, quote, "It appears that their lives together were not as happy as the images posted on social media suggest." Now, this investigator did stress that Dan Colgate was not a suspect in Esther's disappearance, but this didn't stop the media from painting a less than ideal picture of the couple's relationship. I read a lot of speculation about how the couple might have been kind of butting heads over their nomadic lifestyle that I've mentioned a few times here, about how Esther wanted to keep traveling in the van and Dan maybe was ready to settle down a little bit more. The media even got their hands on some CCTV footage of Esther in a supermarket just a few days before her disappearance. And of course, the media used this footage to further the narrative that Esther was in a bad mental state at the time. The footage shows Esther being confused about the price of some chia seeds. She was in Spain after all, and she was not fluent in Spanish, that's my understanding. Then another customer in the store helped translate for her, and this customer was later interviewed and described Esther as looking sad and thoughtful. And let's be honest, this really isn't that much evidence of anything, right? I mean, it's just some low resolution footage of Esther shopping and one quote from a random lady who talked to her for literally just a few seconds. But unfortunately, that's all it took to further fuel the media speculation that Esther and Dan were in trouble in their relationship. And this theory was being speculated over so much that eventually Dan Colgate felt the need to respond personally. On February 2nd, 2021, he wrote on the couple's Facebook page, quote, "Regarding suggestions that Esther's disappearance was in some way voluntary, my response remains that she had neither the motive or the means to do so. She hasn't accessed any funds or been seen anywhere despite widespread press coverage. I am of course aware of the speculation in the media regarding our relationship, stoked by quotations from both police sources and people that met Esther during her time away. So far, I have been loath to even engage with such salacious nonsense, believing that it was nobody else's business. All I will say here is that the police officers actually investigating her disappearance have full access to our communications, which reflect the truth that our relationship is solid. Any comments to the contrary reflect a misunderstanding of that reality." But if Dan was outright dismissing speculation that the state of their relationship may have caused Esther to run away, well then, what was his explanation for her disappearance? And to be clear, he certainly didn't owe anyone an explanation for this, but this question is the question that many people were asking him. And it was a question that eventually he felt enough pressure to answer. In that very same Facebook post, Dan concluded that, quote, "Somebody else has been involved in Esther's disappearance and against her will." And I got to admit, his reasoning for this bold claim was pretty solid. Dan explained that the weather during Esther's disappearance was excellent. That was the exact word that he used, actually. And he also explained that Esther was very good about communicating her routes, her plans, and the type of terrain that she was hiking on. He also explained that cell phone signal in the area that she disappeared from was actually pretty solid, at least for mountain standards. It was much better than people had previously thought when she first disappeared. He also mentioned just how determined Esther was, and that he believed that if she had suffered an injury out there, she still would have made it out of the backcountry, or at least put herself in a position to be found by searchers. He wrote, quote, "Even if she had a broken leg, I have no doubt she would have still gotten down the mountain somehow. Never mind take action to make shelter and become visible." In reference to Esther running off intentionally, Dan noted that despite all of the widespread media coverage that her story was getting, nobody had spotted or recognized her in public anywhere, and he also mentioned that she hadn't accessed her bank account. And of course, he also stressed that she was experienced enough to know that if she intentionally disappeared, it would launch a massive search for her. He wrote, quote, "The idea that she would trigger that," again referring to the search effort, "and put others at risk to get some time alone, rather than simply say, I need some time alone, is ridiculous to me." Dan then summed things up pretty well with this paragraph. Quote, "The core fact is this. A happy, experienced, well-equipped, and fit young woman went missing in an area with clear paths and mostly open terrain. An intensive search found no sign of her or of any of her equipment. It is as though she vanished into thin air." All of the factors mentioned in this Facebook post are what led Dan to conclude that Esther may have been the victim of foul play. And of course, going back to the media, as eager as they were to keep this story in the headlines, they jumped on this statement from Dan and they plastered it everywhere. Dan also made a statement to the Daily Mirror that he had run into some hunters while he was out searching for Esther, and he speculated that maybe she had been killed by somebody who was armed in the mountains. Now, one thing that I think is important to note here is that despite his statements, Dan never dismissed the possibility that an accident could have happened. He did say that he felt it was highly unlikely, but he never said that he was like 100% sure that Esther had disappeared due to foul play. And his actions backed up this sentiment because he continued to search the mountain by himself on foot. And during the summer of 2021, additional organized searches were carried out as well. And then on July 23rd, 2021, a trail runner discovered human bones right along the French-Spanish border in an area known as Port de la Glare. Glare? I can't say that word, folks, I'm sorry, but you'll recall that Esther had actually texted Dan about heading into this exact area right before she disappeared. DNA testing quickly commenced, and a week later, it was announced to the public that the bone that had been found, which was a skull bone, did in fact belong to Esther Dingley. So this was obviously a bombshell break in the case, but of course, the rest of Esther's remains were still missing, as was her gear and her clothing. The case was definitely now broken wide open, but it hadn't yet been solved. Dan Colgate, for his part, still determined to find his partner, continued his solo search efforts, and a few weeks later, they paid off, you could say, although in a very, very sad way. On August 9th, 2021, Dan Colgate himself found the rest of Esther Dingley's remains, as well as the equipment that she had been carrying when she disappeared. Let's just sit in that for a second. I mean, it's just unbelievable to me that the disappearance of Esther was solved by her own partner. I don't think I've ever covered a story where that's happened before. It's a testament to how hard Dan Colgate worked to get the closure that he and Esther's family so badly deserved. I even read in one article that he walked over 700 miles in 1 month just searching for Esther. The day after Dan made this discovery, it was announced to the media that Esther had been found. Police investigations quickly determined that her death was not due to foul play, and it was definitely not due to relationship issues, by the way. It was rather due to the one thing that everyone thought was impossible after such a thorough search had taken place. She had died because of a fall, aka an accident in the backcountry. Despite this, albeit tragic end, but still an end to the story of Esther Dingley's disappearance, the media was still determined to milk it for all that they could. Following his discovery of Esther's body, Dan Colgate met with the police to give a statement about what he had found. This seems like pretty standard procedure to me. Wouldn't you agree? I mean, if you find a dead body, obviously the police are gonna want to talk to you about what you found. For some journalists, not all of them, but some of them, well, they tried to reframe Dan's post-discovery interview with the police like this. Hiker Esther Dingley's boyfriend quizzed at length by cops after finding her body. I mean, that's just pretty scummy, isn't it? I mean, I feel so bad for Dan Colgate. In addition to the stress and the heartbreak of losing his life partner, also having to deal with the spotlight from the media like this, and to have to deal with journalists looking to take advantage of his situation and paint him in a bad light, well, I can't even imagine how tough that must have been. And so for that reason, I encourage all of you to go show Dan Colgate some love in the comments section. So we're never gonna know exactly what caused Esther Dingley to fall while she was hiking, but from all of the research I've done, it seems as though an accidental death is pretty much all but indisputable. The location of her body and the way that her gear was like scattered clearly indicated this fall, and her autopsy results supported it as well. And that actually brings me to an important point that I want to make, a point that I mentioned at the beginning of this video. When somebody goes missing, there's always going to be speculation. And I'm not even saying that there's anything wrong with speculation. I mean, it's important to discuss all different possible theories so that you can eventually get to the truth of what happened. However, this story is a pretty prime example of how even those closest to the case, those that are the most informed about what may have happened, those that are closest to the person that disappeared themselves, well, even these folks can sometimes be wrong. I don't say this to blame Dan Colgate for sharing his opinion that foul play was possible in Esther's disappearance. I don't blame him at all for coming to that conclusion. And honestly, based on the facts that he had available at the time, I think it was a very reasonable conclusion. And if I was in his shoes, I think I would have thought the same thing. Ultimately, though, the one theory that pretty much everyone had dismissed after the search was concluded, not just Dan, but the police as well, this is the theory that ended up being the true reason for Esther's disappearance. I hope that you keep that in mind next time you weigh the validity of speculation over missing persons cases. Speculation can definitely be useful sometimes. Again, don't get me wrong, I do plenty of it on this channel, but at the end of the day, it is just that. It's speculation and it's not fact. Before Esther's funeral, Dan Colgate started a GoFundMe to raise money for a charity that was, quote, close to Esther's heart. The charity is called Sight Savers, who work to cure preventable blindness. Now, Dan's GoFundMe has long since ended, but for my call out this week, I'd like to encourage you to make a small donation to Sight Savers. I figured it would be a good way to honor Esther. I've made a donation myself, and I'll have their page linked in the description. And I'm not affiliated with this charity in any way, but I don't know. I think it'd be a good way to honor Dan as well. My heart goes out to both of them, as well as their families. And I encourage you once again to show some love for Dan and Esther in the comments. YouTube seems to think you'll enjoy watching this video next, so give it a click. And folks, I'll see all of you next week.